What would you do if one morning you walked outside and found the shed you loved, the one that carried decades of family history, completely gone, bulldozed, destroyed, erased without your permission? That's exactly what happened to me. And the people responsible? My very own HOA. But what they didn't know is that this shed wasn't just some old building. It was a hidden piece of history. I still remember that morning like it happened yesterday. The sound of heavy machinery was what woke me up. At first, I thought it was road work or maybe some construction in the neighborhood. But when I stepped outside, my jaw dropped. There, right in front of me, was a bulldozer parked on my property. My shed, the shed my grandfather had built with his own hands, was halfway gone. I shouted. I screamed. I waved my arms to get their attention. But the workers only shrugged and said they were following orders. And whose orders? The HOA. Now, let me tell you something about this HOA. They had always been a pain. The kind of neighbors who care more about lawn color and mailbox height than about people's actual lives. The kind who sent letters if your trash bin was visible for more than an hour. But this was different. They didn't just find me. They didn't just send a warning. They came onto my property without my permission and destroyed something that had been in my family for generations. I was furious. I demanded to know why, and their answer shocked me. The shed doesn't fit community standards. It's an eyesore. An eyesore, that's what they called it. A building that had stood for nearly 100 years. A shed that wasn't just wood and nails. It was a time capsule. My grandfather built it back in the 1930s. Inside, we had old tools, faded photographs, and even some letters from soldiers during World War II who had stayed on our land. This shed wasn't ugly. It was history. But here's where it gets even crazier. After the HOA tore it down, I decided to do some digging. I went to the town records. I looked through old archives. And what I discovered left me stunned. That shed wasn't just my family's treasure. It had actually been listed as a historic landmark decades ago. That's right, a protected landmark, which meant the HOA didn't just overstep. They broke the law. At first, I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to scream at the HOA president, this woman everyone in the neighborhood called Karen, because she always stuck her nose in other people's business. She was the one behind it all. She had signed off on the order to bulldoze my shed. And if you know anything about Karens, you know she didn't care what anyone thought. She believed she was always right. But now, the tables had turned. Because when I showed her the official documents proving my shed was a historic landmark, her smug smile disappeared. For the first time, she didn't have an answer. But before I get ahead of myself, let me take you back to how this all unfolded. That morning, after the bulldozer left, I walked through the rubble. Pieces were scattered everywhere. The old door was split in two. The roof was crushed. I picked up a broken picture frame, and inside it was a photo of my grandfather standing proudly next to that shed decades ago. Tears filled my eyes. This wasn't just about property. This was about legacy, about family, about respect. And the HOA had ripped it away from me without even asking. I called the city office. I filed a complaint. I told them what happened. And when the clerk on the phone asked me for the address, she paused. "Wait a second," she said. "That shed, it's registered as a historic landmark. Did you say it was demolished?" I confirmed. She gasped. "That's illegal." Those words changed everything. You see, when something is labeled a historic landmark, it's protected by law. You can't just tear it down. You can't move it. You can't alter it without special permission from the city, and sometimes even the state. And the HOA, they hadn't done any of that. They had acted like they owned the place. But they didn't. They were about to face consequences they never saw coming. That's when I decided I wasn't just going to let this go. I was going to fight back. I gathered evidence. Photos of the rubble. Old documents showing the landmark status. Letters from my grandfather that proved how important the shed was. And then I went to my neighbors. At first, some of them were hesitant. They were scared of the HOA. After all, the HOA controlled so much. Their fines, their rules, their approvals. But as I told my story, more and more of them began to nod their heads. They had suffered too. Maybe not a bulldozed shed, but unfair treatment, endless harassment, petty fines. My story lit a spark in them. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us, about standing up to an HOA that had gone too far. And that's how the real battle began. I called a lawyer. I reached out to local news stations. I even posted online, sharing pictures of the destruction and explaining what had happened. People were outraged. Strangers from across the country messaged me, saying they couldn't believe an HOA would do something so reckless. The pressure started to build. And when the city officials launched their own investigation, the HOA president, Karen, was forced to face the truth. She wasn't just wrong. She was guilty. CTA and a Section 1. But this was only the beginning. You see, once the truth came out, the fight turned into something much bigger than I ever imagined. Because the law doesn't just punish people for destroying landmarks. It makes them pay. And soon, the HOA that thought they could bully me would find themselves in a nightmare of their own making. Stay with me, because in the next part, I'll reveal how I took the HOA to court, how the community rallied behind me, and how justice finally came crashing down on the very people who thought they could silence me. Imagine thinking you're untouchable, and then realizing the very law you ignored is about to crush you. That's exactly what happened to my HOA and their Karen president. They thought bulldozing my shed was the end of the story. They had no idea. It was just the beginning of theirs. When I learned my shed was a protected historic landmark, my anger turned into determination. I knew this wasn't just about me. It was about principle. If they could destroy my shed without permission, what else could they get away with? How many more families would they push around if nobody stood up to them? The first step was filing a lawsuit. My lawyer was almost shocked when I laid out the case. They bulldoze a registered landmark, he asked, eyebrows raised. That's not just a mistake. That's a violation of state and federal preservation laws. They're in serious trouble. Those words gave me hope. For once, I wasn't powerless. Karen, of course, tried to spin the story. At the next HOA meeting, she stood up in front of everyone, arms crossed, chin raised, and claimed she was protecting property values. She said the shed was unsafe and that she acted in the community's best interest. But the more she talked, the worse it sounded, because everyone in that room had seen what happened. Everyone knew she had ordered the bulldozer without asking. And when I held up the official documents, the ones proving my shed was a historic landmark, the room went silent. The look on her face was priceless. That smug confidence cracked. For once, Karen didn't have control. Word spread fast. The local news picked up the story. Reporters showed up at my driveway, asking me to walk them through the rubble. Cameras zoomed in on broken wood, scattered photographs, and pieces of history lying in the dirt. My voice shook as I explained what the HOA had done, but I stood tall. And when the news aired, something amazing happened. Support started pouring in. Neighbors who had once stayed silent finally spoke up. Strangers from across the country reached out. Some even sent me old photos of similar sheds from the same era, proof that this wasn't just a random shack. It was part of a bigger story, a piece of history worth preserving. Meanwhile, the HOA was scrambling. They hired their own lawyer, tried to shift the blame onto the workers, even claimed they didn't know about the landmark status. But ignorance was an excuse. The documents had been public record for decades. If anything, their negligence only made them look worse. The court date was set, and as it got closer, the pressure on the HOA grew heavier. People in the community started attending meetings in record numbers, demanding answers. Petitions were signed. The City Preservation Office announced they were investigating not just the shed's demolition, but the HOA's entire handling of community property. Karen's reign of control was cracking. The day we finally stood in court, I felt nervous but ready. I had my lawyer by my side, the documents in my hand, and a crowd of neighbors filling the benches behind me. When the judge entered, the room went quiet. My lawyer presented the case clearly. The shed was a registered historic landmark. The HOA had no authority to demolish it. Their actions caused permanent damage, not only to me but to the community's history. He showed the photos, the records, even expert testimony from a historian who confirmed the shed's importance. Then it was Karen's turn. She tried to argue that the shed was falling apart and a safety hazard. But when the judge asked her if she had obtained the necessary permits, she couldn't answer. When asked if she had consulted the City Preservation Board, she looked down. The judge didn't look impressed. After hours of testimony, the ruling came down like thunder. The HOA had broken the law. They were guilty of illegally demolishing a historic landmark. And the punishment? Severe. The HOA was ordered to rebuild the shed exactly as it had been, using the same materials and design. They were fined heavily, not just for the destruction, but for trespassing and overstepping their authority. On top of that, they had to pay damages to me for emotional distress and loss of property. Karen's face went pale as the judge read the verdict. For once, she had no words. But the story didn't end there. The ruling sparked something bigger. The community realized they had been living under fear of the HOA for too long. People began demanding reforms, new leadership, and accountability. And within months, Karen was voted out as president. Her reputation was ruined. As for me, the rebuilding process began. Skilled craftsmen were brought in, guided by old photographs and blueprints, to recreate the shed exactly as it once stood. It wasn't easy. It wasn't fast. But every nail, every beam, felt like justice being restored. When the shed was finally complete, we held a small gathering. Neighbors came together, not just to see the restored landmark, but to celebrate what it represented: resilience, unity, and the power of standing up against injustice. Looking back, I realized the shed was more than just a building. It was a symbol. The HOA thought they could erase history, silence me, and control everything. But instead, they ended up exposing their own corruption and uniting a community against them. And Karen, the woman who once believed she was untouchable, she became a cautionary tale, a reminder that no one is above the law. CTA end of section 2. So here's the question I'll leave you with. If your voice was taken, if your history was destroyed, would you fight back or would you let it go? Because sometimes the battles we don't choose end up defining who we are. Backhand index pointing right, don't forget to share this story. Because what happened to me could happen to anyone living under an HOA. And maybe, just maybe, your voice will be the one that sparks change in your own community.